Greetings, comrades! We are halfway through the 7th level of our Russian Conspiracy Theory Iceberg, and we are not slowing down. Once again, today's content is not for the faint of heart. We'll be discussing Dnipropetrovsk maniacs and the YouTuber who had cameras implanted directly into his eyes. There'll also be some history, Stenka Razin and false Dmitry I, not to mention our beloved space race. Why do you think the Soviet shuttle never made a single flight with a human on board? Was the USSR unable to build such ships? No, the Buran was just cursed. Buran cursed. Buran, the Soviet reusable spacecraft and the country's response to the space shuttle, should have been the crowning achievement of Soviet cosmonautics. Instead, however, the giant made only one flight in 1988, and now its remains are living out their days in the Kazakh desert. How did this happen? Many believe that this project literally drained the Soviet space program and became one of the most painful blows to the country's economy at the time. The Energia Buran program cost the budget a colossal amount of money, according to various estimates between 14 and 16.5 billion Soviet rubles. But who needs economic and political reasons when there are more interesting ones? It's simple. The Buran spacecraft was cursed. In July 1977, 8 test pilots were selected for a top-secret mission. They were named the Wolf Pack, after their leader Igor Volk. No one could have imagined at the time that Volk would be the only one from the first group to live to a ripe old age. The first victims appeared even before the squadron was officially formed. Viktor Bukreev burned alive in his MiG-25 Pu. The second victim was Alexander Lysenko, who died on June 23, 1977, when he and his partner crashed in a MiG-23. The pilot, who had no connection to Buran, survived and continued to fly, but Alexander died. On September 8, 1980, Oleg Kononenko's plane crashed into the sea. After his death, rumors of the Buran curse spread among superstitious pilots. Of course, the profession of a test pilot has always been extremely dangerous, but even against this backdrop, the series of tragedies in the elite squadron seemed ominous. A new recruitment drive for the squadron was announced, but there were fewer applicants than usual. They say that at Kononenko's wake, one of the candidates, Vladimir Turovets, wrote a poem on a napkin that ended with the words, "Who's next?" On February 8, 1981, he himself became the next. The fact that members of the Wolf Pack were dying one after another seems strange not only to their colleagues. The KGB and GRU took up the case. They did not believe in mysticism, but they did believe in the work of enemy intelligence services. However, thorough investigations repeatedly concluded that all the disasters were tragic accidents. The project continued. There was even a brief pause in the mysterious deaths, during which 2 cosmonauts from the team, Igor Volk and Anatoly Levchenko, managed to fly into space on a regular Soyuz spacecraft, and even returned alive. However, Levchenko presumably developed a brain tumor during a hard landing. 6 months after the flight, on August 6, 1988, he died. The first flight of the Buran had not even taken place yet, but 5 of its test pilots had already died. The 6th was Alexander Shukin, who crashed in Su-26M sports plane in Zhukovsky on August 18, 1988. During his funeral, Remata Stankevichus flew over him in the sky, following an old Air Force tradition. 2 years later, on September 9, 1990, Stankevichus crashed in a Su-27 during an exhibition performance at the Salgareda Air Show in Italy, becoming the 7th victim. Ultimately, it was decided that the first Buran flight on November 15, 1988 would be conducted in automatic mode without pilots, and it went perfectly. The next flight of the Buran, already with cosmonauts on board, was planned for 1991. But then, as you know, the curse decided to play big and destroyed an entire country, just to prevent the giant with people on board from going to space. However, the death did not end there. Nikolai Sadovnikov, who had left the program, died from injuries sustained during 2 ejections in 1994. In 2001, Yuri Sheffer died suddenly from a blood clot. A month and a half later, Yuri Prihodko died of cancer. The end of the story was tragic and symbolic. On May 12, 2002, the only Buran spacecraft that had flown into space met its end at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Sadly, not alone. The concrete roof of the assembly and test complex collapsed, burying both the shuttle and 8 repair crew members. With the disappearance of the most powerful and expensive Soviet spacecraft, its curse disappeared as well. With the death of Buran, the unexpected death of its testers ceased. Cameras in my eyes. Dystopian stories have taught us to fear total surveillance. But what if governments, secret organizations, or even aliens are watching us not with the cameras on the streets or smartphones, but by implanting cameras directly into people's eyes? And at least one Russian blogger believes so. Meet Alem Kulahmetov. He ran a YouTube channel for 7 years, and every video was titled the same: Video Cameras in the Eyes. Alem lives in Perm and works, or rather worked, as an auto electrician, a bus assembler, until the summer of 2014, when he decided to tell the whole world the truth. By that point, he had known for a year and a half that he was being followed. It began when he started dating a girl named Oksana. He believes that his relationship with Oksana was just a cover for a sinister experiment on him. He was convinced that a chip had been implanted in his head and that video cameras had been inserted directly into his eyes. This allows the observers to see everything he sees without his consent. Of course, Alem was not going to take this lightly. He tried to fight back throughout many videos, literally removing the cameras from his eyes with tweezers and forks. He also cut and removed the upper layer of his cornea without anesthesia, recording the entire process on camera, but it didn't make him feel any better. Fortunately, YouTube protected you from this spectacle in time, and Alem's new videos of his experiments are blocked immediately. His last video was 2 months ago. It's clear that his illness hasn't improved, and he still believes in surveillance and cameras. But at least his eyes are still in place, which is good news, I guess. An-24 kindergarten crash. In the Soviet Union, they loved to hide disasters. But how do you hide a military transport plane crashing into a kindergarten in broad daylight? As it turns out, you can try. On May 16, 1972, at noon, in the resort town of Svetogorsk, located in the Kaliningrad region, an An-24T aircraft belonging to the Baltic Fleet crashed into a local kindergarten. As a result, 35 people were killed, 8 crew members and passengers on board, as well as 27 people on the ground, including 24 children. Authorities reacted immediately by sending the military, the KGB and the police to the scene of the disaster. To avoid publicity, a state of emergency was declared in the city. Telephone communications were cut off, the telegraph stopped working, and electricity was shut down in homes. Residents of Svetogorsk were strongly advised not to leave their apartments. KGB officers walked around the city, convincing everyone that no disaster had occurred. Of course, the whole city knew about the tragedy. In just 9 hours, all the wreckage from the plane and the destroyed building was removed from the scene of the tragedy. By the morning of May 17th, a small garden square had been laid out on the site of the former kindergarten. The very next day. To minimize publicity on the day of the victim's funeral, commuter trains were cancelled, and traffic was restricted on roads connecting the regional center to Svetogorsk. The Soviet media remained silent about the tragedy, but information leaked to the West. On the same day, Radio Free Europe reported on what had happened. But what had happened on board that day? Officially, the cause was classified, blaming it all on unsatisfactory training and flight management. But the crew commander, Vilor Gutnik, was a top-class pilot with nearly 5,000 hours of flight time. By the way, no criminal case was opened, only an internal investigation which resulted in the dismissal of about 40 military personnel. Today, many experts believe that negligence on the part of the army command was the main cause of the tragedy. The night before the flight, the Soviet Navy Air Force decided to replace the altimeters on the An-24s with those from Il-14. However, they forgot to check that the new altimeters were working properly. As a result, the crew of Flight 05 flew at minimum altitude but believed they had an additional 60 to 70 meters of reserve below them. So the main blame for the tragedy lay with those who ordered such an urgent replacement and sent the plane on its flight. But of course, they did not suffer any serious punishment. To finally close the issue, rumors were started that alcohol had been found in the blood of the deceased pilots, a cynical lie to shift all the blame onto the dead. Dnipropetrovsk maniacs. Remember when I told you about the Irkutsk hammer killers? If you think their story is the epitome of cruelty, you are mistaken. They had predecessors who may have inspired them. The Dnipropetrovsk maniacs claimed 21 victims in just a couple of months. Viktor Sayenko, Igor Suprunyuk, and Alexander Ganja. The latter, however, did not kill anyone as he was afraid of blood, and only performed ancillary duties, so there were two main characters in this story, Sayenko and Suprunyuk. As in the Irkutsk case, they were very young, just over 19 years old. As in that case, they recorded everything on video. And even the strange leader-follower relationship is present here too. Viktor Sayenko's school nickname was Boy Girl because he was very attached to Suprunyuk and did whatever his friend wanted. The boys first got into trouble with the law in 5th grade when they were caught for hooliganism. Then came animal abuse and brutal beatings of their peers. They basically disfigured two classmates for life. But they got away with it every time. Why is that? Because Sayenko and Suprunyuk's parents were important people in Dnipropetrovsk. Sayenko's father worked in the prosecutor's office. Suprunyuk's mother was a high-ranking official, and his father was a former pilot for Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma. This impunity gave them a sense of absolute permissiveness. In the summer of 2007, they went on a killing spree in Dnipropetrovsk and its surroundings. In a short period of time, they committed 21 murders, all in the same way. They attacked random passers-by suddenly and for no apparent reason, beating their victims to death with hammers, metal rods, and other heavy objects. Many of the victims were mutilated and tortured, some had their eyes gouged out while still alive. Suprunyuk and Sayenko were so confident in their ability to avoid capture that they knocked a girl off her scooter with a hammer and stole it in broad daylight in front of numerous witnesses, but the police refused to open a criminal case. It was only once they began finding 2 bodies a day that the police had to admit a maniac was on the loose at Dnipropetrovsk. The killers were so cocky that they didn't even try to hide. In fact, they once tried to pawn the victim's phone using their real passports. It was this mistake that led investigators to them. They were caught, and the phones containing dozens of video files became the main evidence in court. Nevertheless, the killers insisted on their innocence until the end. Their lawyers and parents tried to prove that the case was fabricated and the videos had been edited. It didn't work. The pair received life sentences. But the main question remained unanswered. Why? The court was unable to establish a clear motive. There are several versions of the events. First, the press reported that Vladimir Shuba, the prosecutor of the Dnipropetrovsk region at the time, was subjected to tremendous pressure during the investigation to conceal the names of other accomplices in the case. Rumors circulated that other suspects had initially been detained in connection with the case, including the son of a high-ranking police officer and the nephew of the former governor. However, they were allegedly released, and all the blame was pinned on Sayenko and Suprunyuk. The name of their fourth friend is known for certain, Danilo Kozlov, whom the police released in exchange for testimony against Sayenko and Suprunyuk, although he was definitely aware of all their activities and may even have gone out hunting with them. There were also rumors that the crimes could be linked to larger shadow structures such as organized criminal groups, which would explain the initial inaction of the police and the inability to quickly bring the killers to justice. The second theory is that the murders were not just sadistic entertainment, but a kind of ritual associated with a neo-Nazi or Satanist cult. When studying the correspondence of the maniacs, it was discovered that they referred to their targets as slaves and believed that the victims would serve them in the afterlife. Finally, the third version is the most terrifying. Viktor Sayenko and Igor Supruniuk did not commit the murders for pleasure. They were fulfilling an order to create so-called snuff films, video recordings of real murders sold on the black market. Allegedly, the ex-girlfriend of one of the criminals and their former classmate claimed that the guys had received an order from a wealthy foreign client for 40 videos, in exchange for a huge reward. This at least explains why they carefully recorded all their crimes. Whether this is true or not, we will never know, but some of these videos did indeed end up on the internet. If you've ever heard of the video 3 Guys, 1 Hammer, yes, it was them. USSR lost the war to Germany. Perhaps one of the most global conspiracy theories, because how can the outcome of an entire world war be concealed, and one that is so well documented? But some believe that the real outcome of World War II was the Soviet Union's defeat and Germany's victory. How is this possible? Vladimir Razin, a former GRU legal residency employee in Geneva who fled to the UK in 1978, promotes this theory. There he adopted the pseudonym Viktor Suvorov and became the author of numerous books describing his unusual perspective on World War II. In his opinion, the main cause of the war was Stalin's dictatorial policy, which aimed to seize European states. According to Suvorov, in the summer of 1941, the Red Army was preparing to attack Germany and subsequently capture the rest of Europe. However, German troops thwarted these plans by attacking first. He cites the huge concentration of Soviet troops on the western border in 1941, the mass production of offensive weapons and the lack of defensive ones as evidence. No defensive lines were built deep inside the country. In his opinion, all of this is uncharacteristic of a country preparing for defense. Suvorov also interpreted Stalin's May 5th speech to military academies graduates as a direct call for offensive warfare. In other words, Hitler was merely defending himself against the USSR, according to Suvorov. Therefore, even after winning the Great Patriotic War, the USSR did not achieve its ultimate goals in World War II, such as establishing complete control over Europe and sparking a world revolution. The subsequent Cold War and the Soviet Union's economic exhaustion are seen as evidence of a strategic defeat. Of course, it's crucial to state that the vast majority of professional historians around the world reject this theory. In 1941, the Red Army was in extremely poor condition due to repression and reorganization, was completely unprepared for a large-scale offensive, and Stalin was clearly trying to delay entering the war at any cost. Anatoly Bugorskiy. Do you think it's possible to survive being exposed to a beam of energy 300 times greater than a lethal dose of radiation? Yes, if you are Anatoly Bugorskiy, a physicist from Protvino. On July 13, 1978, something went wrong with the U-70, the USSR's largest particle accelerator at the Institute of High Energy Physics. The safety system activated, and Bugorskiy looked into the accelerator channel to find the malfunction. At that moment, the safety mechanism failed, and the silent, invisible beam of protons flying at nearly the speed of light pierced his head. Bugorskiy received about 2,000 grays at the entrance and 3,000 grays at the exit. A lethal dose is about 5 grays. He was urgently taken to a special clinic in Moscow, where doctors were prepared only to witness his inevitable and painful death. The incident itself was immediately classified. But Bugorskiy survived, and according to him, he didn't feel any pain, just a bright flash. Due to nerve damage, the left side of his face was paralyzed, his left ear was deaf, and he now suffers from epileptic seizures from time to time. In all other respects, however, Anatoly was completely healthy. How is this possible? He was incredibly lucky. The proton beam was only 2 by 3 mm in size and passed through his brain without touching any critical areas. If the beam had been slightly wider and affected more cells, he certainly would have died. He returned to scientific work and 2 years later defended his candidate of sciences dissertation on that very particle accelerator. And judging by what I found in Russian scientific databases, he continued to publish articles until at least 2018. Truly, it was the work of a lifetime. Gogol was buried alive. Nikolai Gogol, the great Russian or Ukrainian writer, had a rather peculiar phobia. He was terrified of being buried alive. So much so that he sent his will to all his friends in advance, writing, "Do not bury my body until there are clear signs of decomposition." The thing is, in 1839, the writer suffered from malaria encephalitis, a disease accompanied by fainting spells and prolonged sleep, which made the writer fear being mistaken for dead. Gogol died in 1852, less than a month before his 43rd birthday, after effectively starving himself to death during a religious fast. 3 days later, he was buried in the Danilov Monastery Cemetery in Moscow. Almost 80 years later, the monastery grounds were converted into a shelter for homeless children by the Soviet power. It was then decided to exhume the writer's remains and transfer them to Novodevichy Cemetery. Not only specialists, but also a delegation of Soviet writers were present at the exhumation on May 31, 1931. Vladimir Lidin, a writer and one of the eyewitnesses, later claimed that the interior lining of the coffin was scratched when it was opened. Gogol's body was in an unnatural position with his head turned to the side. It was as if Gogol has regained consciousness in the coffin and spent his final hours desperately trying to escape. However, that was not the most gruesome discovery. According to the most widely accepted version of the legend, the skull of Gogol was missing from the coffin. Where did it go? Rumors spread that the skull had been stolen long before, commissioned by theater collector Alexei Bakhrushin, who sought out such gruesome artifacts. However, some do not believe these stories at all. Gogol spent his last days under the constant supervision of Moscow's best doctors, who would not have overlooked his lethargic sleep. Sculptor Nikolai Ramazanov, who made Gogol's death mask, was also certain that Gogol was dead. In his notes, Ramazanov said the writer's fears were unfounded and that it was just an eternal, unending sleep. The rotation of the body in the grave is explained by natural causes, the destruction of the coffin boards and the pressure of the soil. But then, where did the skull go? Who disturbed the writer's eternal sleep? Was it really eternal initially? American authors of the Russian Constitution. And here's another conspiracy theory about the events of 1993, or more precisely what followed them. Let me remind you that the political crisis in Russia ended with President Yeltsin's victory. Shortly thereafter, the country hastily adopted a new constitution, which gave the head of state virtually unlimited powers. Officially, its authors are considered to be Russian lawyers Sergei Alexeyev, Anatoly Sobchak, and Sergei Shahrai. But what if this is just a smokescreen? Some believe that the real think tank that wrote the main law of the new Russia was located overseas, in the United States. According to this theory, American lawyers from the Czech consulting firm, working on the behalf of the US government, played a huge role in drafting the Russian constitution. They developed the main provisions of Russia's fundamental law, then the document was only slightly edited. I usually present arguments for and against, but remember the US aid agency whose funding was recently cut by Donald Trump. For a long time, there was a page on the agency's official website dedicated to its work in Russia. It stated in black and white that US aid participated in the development of the Constitution of the Russian Federation, as well as the civil and tax codes. One could argue at length about whether their contributions were in the country's best interest and how significant they were. But if the question is, did the Russian Constitution have American authors? The answer is yes, it did. Mother Ukraine. The Motherland monument in Kiev is the younger brother, or rather sister, of a similar monument in Volgograd. Initially, the monument was to be built by the same sculptor, Yevgeny Vuchetich, but in 1974, shortly after work began, he died suddenly. Rumors spread that Vuchetich had modeled the statue's face after his daughter, who also died shortly thereafter, giving the monument an ominous aura. Due to this negative reputation, many renowned sculptors declined to take on the cursed project until Vasily Brodai accepted. First the curse of the spaceship, now the curse of the monument, what's next? However, the locals believe that the monument itself was not cursed, but rather the land on which it stood. The monument was erected on a historic hill called Black Mountain, which had long had a bad reputation in Kiev. Legend had it that birds did not fly over it, animals avoided it, and any buildings erected there burned down or sank into the ground. Many believe that building a giant idol with a sword in such an unclean place would bring misfortune to the city and country. Perhaps this is why, after its construction was completed, the statue took on a life of its own in urban legends. According to old-timers and tour guides, at exactly midnight, the monument's arms would move and the statue would strike its sword against its shield, producing a hollow, ringing sound. Others claim that as night fell, the statue would make a full turn around its axis. But let's end with the most harmless and plausible mystery about the monument. Take a closer look at the sword. It looks disproportionately short for such a massive figure. Why? According to a Kiev legend, the sword was shortened at the Kiev Metropolitan's urgent request. He said the sword should not be taller than the bell tower's cross at the nearby Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. Strangely enough, the Soviet authorities agreed to this concession but justified it on the grounds of architectural balance. Treasures of Stepan Razin. Stepan Razin. To some, he is a folk hero and protector. To others, he is a cruel robber and rebel. Regardless of who he was, his name is associated with one of Russia's greatest mysteries, the secret of his untold treasures. Razin's treasure was based on the fabulous loot from his famous campaign in Persia. According to eyewitness accounts, the Cossacks plundered the richest cities, and the Ottoman's treasury overflowed with gold, silver and precious stones. Further military successes, including the capture of Astrakhan, Tsaritsyn, Samara and Saratov, significantly replenished the treasury. However, in 1671, Razin was captured and executed, and his wealth suddenly vanished. So, where could it be? The ataman's younger brother, Frol Razin, confessed under torture that he knew the treasure's location. He promised to reveal it in exchange for his life. According to legend, he dragged the Tsar's servants around the Don and Volga rivers for 5 years. Eventually, the authorities lost their patience and Frol was executed too. Did he take the secret with him to his grave? Or was there no treasure at all? Most people believe that it does exist. However, finding it is hindered by, that's right, the curse again. According to legend, Razin's treasures are enchanted and can be only obtained by those who sprinkle them with the blood of an innocent person. For 3.5 centuries, hundreds of treasure hunters have tried their luck, focusing on 3 main search locations. The first is a cave located in the Zhiguli Mountains near Samara. Every year, dozens of people come with metal detectors and find coins and bullets from that period, but no one has ever found the main treasure. The second site is the town of Kogalnitsky on the Don River, where Stepan was captured and handed over to the Tsarist troops. It would make sense for him to have hidden the riches somewhere nearby. The third is the numerous high cliffs along the Volga River, especially Devichi Cliff. Such places were traditionally considered reliable hiding places for loot. However, there are more than 100 potential locations where the treasure could be, as riverbeds have changed over the centuries, ravines have crumbled and cave entrances may have been blocked. Finally, artificial reservoirs were built. So a hiding place that could have been discovered in the 17th century is now probably hidden under a thick layer of soil or water. False Dmitry I was real. False Dmitry I, who ascended the Russian throne in 1605, was… no, not cursed, you guessed wrong. He was just not false, but the real Tsarevich Dmitry, son of Ivan the Terrible, who allegedly miraculously escaped Uglich in 1591. During the murder of the prince, which was orchestrated by Boris Godunov, another boy replaced Dmitry and became the victim while he was secretly taken abroad. Today, official history believes that the name False Dmitry was used to conceal Grigory Otrepyev, a monk and deacon of the Chudov monastery who fled to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1601 and declared himself the heir to the throne who had miraculously survived. But history is written by the victors. What if the real legitimate Tsar had ascended the Russian throne in 1605? The most compelling argument is his mother's recognition of him. In July 1605, Ivan the Terrible's last wife, Maria Nagaya, publicly met with the young man and recognized him as her son. For Moscow, this was decisive proof. Why would a mother lie by sending an impostor to the throne? Many boyars and members of the royal family also recognized him as Dmitry, noting the royal bearing, education and confidence of the false Dmitry in his origins. He behaved not like an impostor, but like a man who firmly believed in his own righteousness. Where could a simple monk have acquired such manners? However, after ascending the throne, this true prince began to behave very strangely. He violated centuries-old church and palace customs, wore European clothes, and surrounded himself with Polish Catholics. Most importantly, he never had any epileptic seizures, from which the real Tsarevich Dmitry was known to suffer. For all these suspicious antics, he was deposed, killed, and his body was loaded into a cannon and fired toward the Polish border. Killer Doctor's Plot. The Doctor's Plot, also known as the case of the murderous doctors, was one of the last major political repressions in the Soviet Union under Stalin. It began with a Pravda article entitled "Despicable Spies and Murderers in the Guise of Professors and Doctors." The article reported on the arrest of a group of Kremlin doctors, most of whom were Jewish. The doctors were accused of conspiracy, working for American and British intelligence, and murdering party leaders. Among the accused were 37 leading Soviet medical specialists and their family members. A key moment came with the death of Andrei Zhdanov, secretary of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks in 1948. Dr. Lydia Timashuk wrote a denunciation claiming that Zhdanov died due to improper treatment. Although initially ignored, this denunciation was retrieved from the archives several years later, and became one of the reasons for the start of the repressions. Mikhail Rumin was the main initiator of the case, but Minister of State Security Abakumov initially held back the process. After Abakumov's arrest, however, the case gained momentum. A wave of anti-Semitic hysteria swept across the country. People were afraid to go to clinics, and neighbors wrote denunciation against doctors with suspicious last names. But at the height of the campaign, a bombshell exploded. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the peoples, died. By April 1st, everyone arrested in connection with the case had been released. The next day, April 4th, the newspaper Pravda published an official statement from the USSR Ministry of Internal Affairs. The statement acknowledged that the charges were false, and that the testimony had been obtained through unacceptable investigative methods. All surviving defendants in the case were fully rehabilitated and reinstated at work. But what would have happened if Stalin had not died? According to one theory, Stalin was planning to deport all Jews in the Soviet Union to Siberia and the Far East. The Doctor's Plot was supposed to provoke public anger, under the pretext of protecting the people from which the evacuation was planned. There is evidence that barracks were already being built and trains were being prepared for this purpose, and only Stalin's timely death prevented this horrific plan from being carried out. Lyudmila Putina's interview. It's been a while since we've had any wild conspiracy theories about Vladimir Putin, hasn't it? In 2015, the internet was rocked by one such theory. Allegedly, Russia's former First Lady, Lyudmila Putina, gave a candid interview to the German newspaper Die Welt. In the interview, she claimed that her ex-husband had been dead for a long time and had been replaced by body doubles in public. She also described her family life with Putin in vivid detail, calling him a very cruel man who beat her. Some versions of the story claim that Lyudmila now lives abroad under a different surname, is under the protection of foreign special services, or has been eliminated. This sounds like an information bomb capable of changing the world. But there is one problem. This interview with Die Welt never happened. All of the screenshots circulated on the internet have been revealed to be crude fakes. The main question, however, is not whether it is true, but rather why this fabrication has proved so enduring and why millions believed it. It is because after her divorce in 2013, Lyudmila Putina, the person who has been so close to the president, simply disappeared from view. Where did she go? What happened to her? No one knew, and this void was filled with conjecture. So much so that they were ready to believe even the most insane theories. Thanks for watching, and as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Petr Ilich, Marina Holiday, Lyudmila Ilyanova, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous. See you guys next time.